In this second part of our presentation on the Gospel of St. Mark, we're going to look at some of the contents of his Gospel. I'm going to share the screen ready for PowerPoint presentation. We've seen how the Gospel of St. Mark was the first Gospel to be written. It was the source, a written source used by St. Matthew and St. Luke when they came to write their own Gospels. They also had other things, some teachings of Jesus that they knew in common, and material of their own that they added. Mark's Gospel is read in the Catholic Church on Sundays in Year B and on the weekdays of weeks 1 to 9 of Ordinary Time. St. Mark's Gospel was written for persecuted Christians. Thanks to blaming Christians for the fire in Rome in the year 64 of the Common Era, there was a terrible persecution launched against the Christians in Rome by the Emperor Nero. And St. Mark seems to have written his Gospel as a source of encouragement for the survivors to stay strong with the faith. I'm sure we're all familiar with the different ways in which the whole Bible is divided not only into separate books, but also into chapters and verses within each of the books. This makes looking at references to particular texts much easier, but the division is often quite arbitrary, and it's more to do with how much space is taken up on a manuscript than any references to the content. Stories can and do cross over into different chapters. In most Bibles today, different stories and separate pieces of teaching are often divided into paragraphs and given titles, but these don't actually appear in the original text itself. All of this is very helpful. It makes something like a gospel much more easily manageable when it comes to read and to study it. The divisions, however, remain arbitrary and an imposition on the text, which may or may not have been in the mind of the original author. When we come to look specifically at St. Mark's Gospel, several suggestions have been made as to how this Gospel might be divided up. Towards the end of the 19th century, a German Protestant scholar called Martin Kahler described St. Mark's Gospel as a passion narrative with an extended introduction. It's a description that has some merit. It's by far the shortest of the four Gospels. Remember, it takes up only about 20 pages in a modern Bible. Remember, the Gospel was written to affirm faith in Jesus Christ, and the central acts that are the foundation of that faith are in the events of his final days, the meal with his disciples, his arrest, his trial, his execution on the cross, and his resurrection 3 days later. These events, quite rightly, take up a significant portion of St. Mark's Gospel, rather more so than the other Gospels. And it's in the Passion narratives that we have the most detailed account of what happened, and at least in the accounts of the arrest, trial, and crucifixion, the closest agreement about the events across all four Gospels. Looking at the actual text of the Gospel, we see that Mark launches straight into the heart of the matter in his opening sentence, the beginning of the Gospel about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. In only 11 verses, he covers the ministry of John the Baptist, Jesus' baptism by John, and his testing by Satan in the desert after fasting for 40 days and 40 nights. Thus, at verse 14, we're told, after John had been arrested, Jesus went into Galilee, proclaiming the gospel from God and saying, the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is drawn near. Repent and believe in the gospel. It's both breathtaking and a prelude to a breathless account of the events that follow, as we shall see. By the same token, the gospel is equally abrupt at its end. Here we find what he writes. And the women came out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and amazement had gripped them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. A very abrupt ending that records no appearances of Jesus, just simply states the fact that he rose from the dead. Other endings were clearly added later to try to make the ending less abrupt. But these are clearly summaries of what appear in the other Gospels, not actually written by St. Mark himself. And whether Mark did have anything else to add, we simply don't know. Having noted these things, various suggestions have been made as to how the Gospel may be divided up into sections, according either to events or maybe to geographical locations. One suggestion that has some merit is in the light of seeing Mark's Gospel as a call to faith. It's to divide the material up into two acts. As it happens, this division between these two acts falls more or less in the middle of the full text itself. Act 1 recounts Jesus' ministry in and around Galilee and culminates in Peter's confession of faith, "You are the Messiah." From this point onward, Jesus' journey towards Jerusalem and his impending passion come to the fore. And Act 2 reaches its climax when, after Jesus' death on the cross, a pagan centurion also makes an act of faith. In truth, this man was Son of God. Now, this is only one suggestion among many, but it does make a certain sense of the direction in which the material Mark sets out is leading, to the profession of faith in Jesus as the Christ, the Messiah. Within the movement of the text itself, the pace of events is almost breathless. Now, by far the best way of seeing this is to read significant chunks of the text for yourself. Scenes are cobbled together with simple conjunctions such as, and at once, such and such, and again, such and such. There's literally no place to stop and to take breath at times. In contrast to the other synoptic Gospels, St. Mark gives more details, some of which are interesting, while others are rather awkward and are dropped by the later Gospel writers. So, in his account of the feeding of the 5,000, St. Mark gives us a detail missed out by both St. Matthew and St. Luke. Jesus instructed them to get all the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. The word for groups is also used in the cultivation of flowers and vegetables in beds. Get them to sit in beds like flowers. A more graphical image than is in the other Gospels, where we're simply told that they were told to sit down. Similarly, the detail of the grass being described as green may easily be overlooked by people like ourselves who are used to grass being green for most of the year. But in the climate of Palestine, grass is only green in the spring, around Passover time. Now, neither St. Matthew nor St. Luke include this detail, but in his account of the miracle, St. John notes the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. Another illustration of the extra, sometimes awkward details given by St. Mark comes in his account of the cure of the woman with a hemorrhage. It's sandwiched, you remember, between his account of the raising of Jairus' daughter. When the woman touches Jesus' cloak, Mark notes, and at once, feeling that power had gone out of him, Jesus turned round in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said, "You see how the crowd's jostling you? How can you say who touched me?" But he began to look round to see who had done it. Both the idea of power going out of him and the questioning by the disciples are omitted in St. Matthew's account of what happened. Now, it's most unlikely that if he wrote his gospel after St. Matthew, St. Mark would have made up this awkwardness, putting, among other things, the disciples in poor light. A similar difference occurs in respect to the accounts of James and John asking to have the places of honor in the kingdom of heaven in chapter 10 of the Gospel. When St. Matthew comes to recount this incident, it is their mother who makes the request on the part of her, no doubt, very embarrassed sons. One further detail about St. Mark's account of Jesus' ministry has come to be known as the Messianic Secret. In the early 20th century, the German biblical scholar Wilhelm Wrede published a book with this title. It wasn't published in English until many decades later. Vrede had noticed that on many occasions in the Gospel, Jesus tells people not to say anything about what he'd done. This happens after many of the miracles the evangelist reports. Sometimes there are crowds of witnesses. How could it possibly be kept a secret? The most ludicrous example of this probably comes at the ending of the story of the raising of Jairus' daughter. Crowds had followed Jesus to the house. They'd heard the people who'd come from the house to tell him not to bother because the young girl had in fact died. He'd even sent wailing mourners away from outside the house. Nonetheless, he goes inside, raises the young woman from the dead, and then turns round to the parents and says he gave them strict instructions that no one should know about it. A whole crowd of people knew what had happened. How could it possibly be kept a secret? Vrede and many others subsequently have come up with various reasons as to why Jesus should say these things. One thing seems certain. Jesus needed the time and the space to make clear exactly what kind of Messiah he would be. There were many different ideas about what the Messiah would do when he came among different groups of Jews at the time. One idea put forward by the Zealots who took up a violent struggle against the Roman occupation of their land was that the Messiah would be one to put together a powerful army that would expel the Romans once and for all. Another religious zealot group thought that the Messiah would be someone who would insist on the purity of ritual observance of the law of Moses in all its aspects and bring in a new era of observance of the covenant. In his ministry, in both his words and his actions, Jesus needed the time and space to map out precisely what kind of Messiah he truly was. This, in fact, is something he finally admits openly only at his trial before the high priest Caiaphas, who asks him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus said, "I am," finally, admitting as to who he is. The call to faith, the main thrust of the gospel, is about to be given its central focus on the cross. In the end, there's no substitute to reading the gospel itself. For obvious reasons, we're given small, manageable sections to listen to on Sundays or weekdays in our gospel readings. This is perfectly understandable. What we lose in this, however, is a sense of how the whole work unfolds. It's a very useful and, in fact, a very important exercise to sit down and to read the whole gospel. If not in one sitting, then certainly several chapters at one go. In this way, we get a perspective on how St. Mark puts together the whole thing, how it truly is a call and an encouragement to faith.